years ago, I was asked to go on a cattle drove in outback Australia with the leadership team of Medibank Private. The purpose of the cattle drove was to raise funds for mental health services because the area had been through some really severe droughts and things were pretty dire for the farmers, their families and the community. My role was to give talks and radio interviews along the way and facilitate some discussions with the leadership group. Being a country boy myself, I was really excited by a cattle drove. It reminded me of a movie I'd always loved called City Slickers, so I decided to watch it again before we left. For those of you that haven't seen the movie, it's about 4 burnt-out middle-aged men who are approaching their 40th birthday. They are struggling with work, with marriage and life, and they decide they're going to get their mojo back by going this cattle drove in Colorado. As soon as they arrive, they're just fish out of water, hopeless with cattle, with horses, and camping. Just can't cope with it. There's a really crusty character, the head cowboy called Curly, who's played by Jack Palance. Curly handles everything with ease. At one point, one of the city slickers, Mitch, who's played by the actor Billy Crystal, is separated from the group with Curly. Mitch starts to whinge about his life and how hopeless it is and just expresses admiration for Curly and his life. To Mitch, Curly appears to be the master of his domain. If a crisis occurs, Curly sorts it out. When he brings home the cattle at the end of a long drove, his life really makes sense in Mitch's own mind. Sensing Mitch's dismay, Curly says, "Do you know what the secret of life is?" Mitch says no. "This." "Your finger?" Curly says, "Just one thing. You stick to that and everything else don't mean crap." Mitch replies, "Oh, that's great, but what is my one thing?" "That's what you have to figure out." I was really struck by Curly's just one thing scene. As we rode for 5 days without internet or phones, it was a great chance to think about what my one thing was. While thinking about my life, a pattern emerged. Most of my days start at 5 o'clock in the morning and I meditate for 30 minutes, followed by a walk in a local national park, and on my return I plan my day. And it often turns out to be a very good day. But I figured that my one thing was probably either meditation or exercise. When I thought about it a bit further, I thought, well, if it has to be one thing, for me it's probably meditation because I do that, leads to the exercise, leads to the planning of the day and the great day. After we finished the cattle drove, we were sitting around in a circle afterwards with the leadership team of Medibank. And I reflected on this story, City Slickers. And I shared my reflection on the last 5 days and that I thought my one thing was meditation. I then asked the group what their one thing was. Now, what surprised me was that they came up with the answers very quickly. For one member, it was when his relationship was right with his wife. Everything else seemed to take care of itself. Happy wife, happy life. For another, it was his two-hour bike rides each week. And for a third, it was quality time with her 4-year-old daughter. Now, I've asked this question hundreds of times in seminars around Australia and even overseas. Responses include beach fishing twice a week, jogging in the bush, coming home after work and watering my plants, having a regular family dinner. I've had a burly coal miner say singing in the choir. And a young woman who lived in North Sydney says that getting into a small aluminium tinny and travelling 10 kilometres out to sea by herself and fishing was her one thing. So I'd like to suggest that you pause the video now and have a discussion with your colleagues about what you think your one thing is. Don't agonise about it. Just nominate 1 or 2 things that are really important to you, that nurture you, that feed your soul. These are things that are inherently good for you. Hopefully, this prompted an interesting discussion for you, and you'll learn something about yourself, but also something very important about your work colleagues. But it's not just enough to know what your one thing is. My challenge to you is to live your one thing. Make sure you do it regularly. Decide when and where you're going to live your one thing, to actually do it. Because according to research by Peter Gollwitzer, a professor of psychology, deciding when and where you're going to do it increases your probability of completion by 300%. Making sure you live your one thing is probably the most important thing you can do. If you can create a culture, a workplace culture, that encourages everyone to live their one thing, you're well on the way to creating a green zone tribe and culture. So, commit to deciding when and where you're going to live your one thing.